Welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder of Zion, and today we are speaking to Arnold Roth, who's the father of Malki Roth, who was murdered in a horrific terror attack in 2001. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
For those who aren't familiar, I was hoping that, and if it's not too painful for you, I was hoping that you could go through, from your perspective, what happened on that day in 2001 for the when the from how you heard about the attack and how you heard about Malki and what happened after that.
Hard for me to be very concise about this. This was something that seemed to go for weeks and weeks. It was the longest day I've ever known. I was running a drug company here in Jerusalem and went out to lunch with two of my colleagues. Got back to my desk about 2 o'clock, and my wife was on the phone. And before I could even say anything, she was shrieking into the phone saying there's been a pigur, which of course means a terrible terrorist attack in the center of town. I can't reach the children, and she hung up. We then had several more conversations over the next hour or so. We were able to reach pretty much all of our children except Malki, and things started to go blacker and blacker from there onwards. It was hours later before we became before we really had entree to the next stage of our lives. It was late at night. The bombing, the massacre took place at 2 o'clock. At about 6 o'clock, one of our neighbors came up the steps. I was at home. All of our children were at home. My wife was at home, to say that our next door neighbor's daughter had been named on the TV news as one of the people who had been murdered. We knew that she was there with Malki, so things looked awful. It was still some hours after that when a neighbor of ours, who was then the head of a department at Hadassah Hospital in Ein Karim in Jerusalem, came up the stairs, grabbed me by the hand and said, "We're going to the hospital. They've got a girl on the operating table." It took us about 3 weeks to get to the hospital. As we walked in, it was a scene out of Dante's Inferno, something that I'll never forget. People with blank faces, a scene of bedlam and chaos, and just awful. We didn't find my daughter there. Somebody walked over who recognized the scene, recognized that this must be who I am, looking for a child or a loved one, and said, there are two girls in the other room over there. One's dead and the other one we're about to operate on. Why don't you check? That was really the moment at which I sort of grabbed a hold of myself and realized this is not just a terrible story, this is the terrible story of my life. And as hard as it was to come to terms with that reality, life didn't really give me a chance. I left the hospital soon after. We're talking now about 11 o'clock, 11:30 at night, and went home as a social worker from the hospital arranged for two of my sons to travel with another social worker down to the pathology lab in Jaffa, Abu Kabir as it's called. And at 2 in the morning, we got a call from our sons, and that's when we knew that there was no room for any more hope.
I mean, that is a parent's worst nightmare, certainly. As you know, you invited me to you have an annual concert. I assume that this year it might be delayed, but you have an annual concert in Malki's memory, and one of the things mentioned in the concert that's actually featured, and is something that you found out during the while you were sitting Shiva, about a song that Malki wrote. Can you speak about that a little?
Yes, everything you've just said is right. Let me start at the other end. The concert is held by the Malki Foundation, which we created during the 7 days of mourning. And it's a fabulous organization. I'm not involved in its day-to-day activity. I'm the honorary chairman, but it does fabulous things around a cause that Malki was passionate about, and that is caring and helping and loving and supporting children with severe disabilities, just like her littlest sister. It's true that during the Shiva we had visits from Malki's classmates. They told us something we didn't know, that there had been a songwriting competition in their school. Malki had decided to take part in it, and thinking that she had all the time in the world, which of course we now know she didn't. She missed the deadline. but she then finished the song and the words and taught it to her friends, but never mentioned it to us at all. So the friends actually sang it in our home during the time when we were at our absolute lowest. It took quite some time, perhaps a year after that, before I even began to think at all, maybe people would like to hear this song. Today, the song exists in various recorded forms, in a variety of places, different arrangements, and they're all lovely. And every year, actually twice a year, we have two concerts, or we have had two concerts each year in Israel, one in Jerusalem and one in Ra'anana, now for a dozen years. That song is always featured in the program. It's upbeat, it's alive, it's exactly the way Malki was, full of love and full of spirit.
And what's the name of the song again?
These days it's called Malki's Song, but it's a song of happiness.
Okay, no, great, and it really is a wonderful song, and it's very heartwarming to know that so many different versions have come out, and so many people in Israel have sung it.
Yep.
Very soon after the attack, something happened at An Najah University, which, in some ways, and to me, it's emblematic of why essentially why peace is impossible. It is. There was what they called an art installation, in which they actually reproduced. This is Hamas, but it's a student organization in Annapolis, in which Hamas reproduced the entire attack. They put together a Sbarro sign saying kosher. The students were watching it. There's blood stains all over, and then pizza slices. I'm showing on the screen right now. When they leave this fake Sbarro store, they have to step on an American and Israeli flag. What went through your mind when you saw this?
This was the month after Malki's murder, and I have to say that I wasn't that much tuned in to what was going on their side of the fence. It was also a very short time after 9/11, and a lot of the thinking that preoccupies me today hadn't even started back then. But it's an opportunity that has arisen again and again and again, unfortunately. The opportunity to just ponder, and I'm trying not to sound too philosophical because we haven't gotten together today to be philosophical, although we easily could. Losing a child produces all kinds of philosophical thinking, but lots of opportunities to think about how broad is the chasm between the lives they live and the lives that we live. I don't mean we, my wife and children. I mean the society in which we've chosen to make our lives here in Israel. And in a larger sense, I would say Jewish life. There is actual, in the literal sense of the word, celebration around the massacre carried out by Tamimi and the gang of Hamas terrorists who helped her. It keeps coming up again and again. It isn't always expressed in quite that dry fashion, something as simple as walking through a replica. What kind of person do you have to be to think of this? A replica of a destroyed Sbarro pizzeria with cheese and blood and flesh, of course they're not real, on the walls, and encouraging people to come in and engage with the positive energy in the place. This is beyond appalling. There's a reflection of that in something that happened much later, but that I think of as stemming from the same emptiness inside their society. Over in Jordan, Jordan preoccupies my mind and has done since 2011. Over in Jordan, there are lots of good things going on. There's lots of positive potential there. It's a country that ought to be doing a lot better than it is. Part of the evidence for that is I personally went there several times back in the late 1990s and was involved in setting up a business with some very interesting and highly placed partners. But it all came to nothing, and I haven't been back there since my daughter's murder. But the reality of a country which has one of the most restrictive media regimes in the world, a country where you can't speak freely and expect to be reported, and if you do say something that doesn't make the authorities happy, you'll go to jail. The idea was to create something different, a counterbalance to that, a school for the best possible journalists, educated in an Arab culture. Fabulous idea. It exists today. It's called the Jordan Media Institute. I could dwell on who created it and who gave it funding, but I'll choose to focus only on the students.
Yeah.
Because in 2014, I became aware that the students of this elite school that was modeled on the Columbia School of Journalism had decided that Ahlam Tamimi was their success model. She was the woman who embodied the values that brought them to journalism. Now, the fact is that she was not a journalist in the conventional sense. She had been studying journalism and was studying journalism on the day that she carried out the massacre. And I do plan to say a couple of things about how all of that came together. But she later went on to become a TV figure. And that gets conflated in the views of these people over there in Jordan into she's a journalist, she's a great journalist, she embodies our kind of journalism, she has our values, voila, she is our success model.
Just to back up slightly, as just in case people don't know, again, Ahlam Tamimi was the essentially the ringleader. She's from the Hamas person who scouted out the location and I believe drove the suicide bomber there, and she was released by Israel and almost unbelievably released in the Gilad Shalit deal. Which at the time I didn't realize that she was one of the people being released. I was actually sort of for the prisoner swap until I realized that how many people with blood on their hands were actually being released by Israel. And she was, she was released on, given the condition that she stays in Jordan, but nobody anticipated she was going to become a celebrity, as you're saying.
So thanks for being linear about this. I've forgotten to do that. Ahlam Tamimi is the woman who spotted various sites in Jerusalem on behalf of Hamas in 2001. She carried out another bombing attack a week before the Sbarro massacre. That was in a building that all Israelis, certainly all Jerusalemites, still call the building of the Mashbir, HaMashbir L'Tzarchan. It's a department store, but it's not. It's been converted into something else by now. But back then, in 2001, HaMashbir, right on the busiest thoroughfare in Jerusalem on King George, just opposite Ben Yehuda, for those who know Jerusalem a little, had a supermarket in its basement. And this woman came to the supermarket with an explosive-filled beer can and placed it on the shelf in the supermarket and walked out. Two things then happened, depending on which version you listen to. If you listen to what Tamimi, Ahlam Tamimi, the Jordanian woman who was then 21 years old and the journalism student, if you listen to what she says about what happened there, it's quite shocking. She says the building exploded and many people were killed, and the Zionists, who were already having a hard enough time, suppressed the whole story. Like many aspects of the Sbarro massacre and the lives of the people around it, it's all invented. None of those things happened. Nonetheless, the woman, Ahlam Tamimi, made herself available for another bombing attack. She had some pretty inflexible requirements by the time the second one was planned, which was only 10 days later. And on that day, she was handed a guitar case filled with explosives, no guitar, with shrapnel, metal, studs, nails, and she was introduced to a young man. He was the bomb, humid bomb. He was given the guitar case, he slung it across his back, and the two of them then headed into Jerusalem. She didn't drive. I don't know if she does drive. I don't think she does. But they took a bus and a taxi and went through the security checkpoint at Kalandia on Jerusalem's north side, not far from where we live, and arrived in the center of Jerusalem just before 2 o'clock. Her instructions to the human bomb were, give me 10 minutes. She had no intention of dying there. He did. Mm. She records that the only question he asked as they approached the site was, are there going to be religious Jewish people there, children? Mm-hmm. Of course, the answer was a given because she had selected the site for precisely those factors. Well, he blew himself up standing next to my daughter and her best friend. And she left before that and was already on her way to Ramallah, which is only 30-minute or so drive from the center of Jerusalem. And she describes graphically on TV, it's on YouTube and many other places, how the mood in the car was quite jubilant when the first reports came in on the radio. They were listening to Israeli radio, but she was struck by how only 3 people had been killed. That's what the radio said. And she was a little bit off, her mood was off. And then she describes how the reports kept coming in, and by the time they reached Ramallah, everybody was jubilant. The police who they passed, the Palestinian Authority police, were handing out candies. Everybody was in total ecstasy because of all of the dead Jews, and especially the dead children. Again, I'm not going to dwell on the philosophical aspects of any of all of this, any of this. I'm repeating it and narrating it as if these were events that happened to somebody else. But it's hard to escape the reality that there is something bestial, that's not an overstatement, going on in their society if they not only allow this kind of activity to happen and then crown it with some title like resistance, but the people who do it are genuine heroes and are paid huge amounts of money relative to the society around them.
It's hard to overstate how monstrous Ahlam Tamimi really is. And I have a very brief clip here, and there's so many more of them. But just over here where she was asked, about how many children, if she knew how many children were killed, it's only a few seconds. And just her happiness at knowing that she thought she only killed 3 kids, and she killed 8, and the smile, and like a beatific smile that she has, that of like, she's just so ecstatic to know, oh wow, look at that, I killed more Jews, far more Jewish children than I thought. It's almost unbelievable. But when you combine that with what you were just starting to say, is that it's not just one monster. One monster you can sort of accept, but this is a monster that's a hero, that's a heroine in Palestinian as well as Jordanian society today. And there are articles today, defending her and saying, that she did the best, a wonderful thing, a wonderful, this attack. And it's just like, it's just so hard to fathom, especially in the West, where everybody believes that everybody's the same and everybody is like, has good in them and stuff like that. There's no good in her, and it's on video. It's no remorse is an understatement. She's incredibly happy that she managed to be part of this.
I've got to interrupt the flow of what you're saying to be really obnoxious. There's no way on earth that at that moment when she was asked that question, she didn't know how many people she murdered. She'd already sat through a murder trial. Sure. She knew exactly. This was all for the effect. Mm-hmm. She was smiling when the judges handed down 16 terms of life imprisonment, and she said, I'm smiling now and I'll smile when I get out of this prison because you're going to let me go. Mm. It's all part of a personality that is genuinely, I have to say, if there is such a thing, satanic. This woman exudes hatred, bigotry of the most lethal kind, and a desire to generate as much discomfort and fear and the opposite, the perception that you're in the company of someone who really, really, really hates you without limit. So that was what we just saw. That's quite something. I don't know if any of us has ever encountered a person as thoroughly evil as this. And it would be nice to say that she's gotten her just desserts, but as you know, she's living free like a queen, a princess, the other side of the river, short distance from here, in Jordan.
Yeah. So there has been effort after she was released, especially going through the U.S. government, because of and I don't remember the name of the law, but under U.S. government law, a terror attack against Americans can be tried in America, and you've been, I know, in the forefront of trying to extradite her to the United States. Can you just go over the timeline of how that's been happening and the more recent events?
She was released from prison along with 1,027 other terrorists, more than 50% of whom were murderers with blood on their hands, in October 2011. At the time, most of that information was concealed from the Israeli public and from the world. The absolute majority of people walking free who were actual killers was something that even today is not spoken about. But having done the analysis and updating my Excel sheet all the time, I know that it's certainly the case. She went back to, well, first she went to Cairo, where she had a formal reception. She was received by Khaled Mashal, who was and is the strong man in Hamas. And from there, she was conveyed as a celebrity traveler to Jordan, which is where she grew up and had been living until a very short time before she came to do her studies in the West Bank. She began a TV show which she presented under the auspices of Hamas in the same week that my wife and I decided that we needed to do what we could do to get her into the hands of justice again. And though you've already mentioned that there is such a law, it was really our job to figure out that an American law exists by which an act of terrorism carried out by a terrorist in which there are American victims who are killed attracts US jurisdiction everywhere in the world, and not only creates the possibility that the Americans will pursue that person, but creates the obligation. At the time that we became aware of that, which was at the very beginning of 2012, there had not been a single case in this country, not one case in which the Americans had prosecuted a terrorist who had killed an American citizen here in the context of the bitter warfare that the Palestinians and the Arabs have been waging against Israelis. So that when I turned up in Washington, together with our lawyer who's been with us the entire time, a wonderful man, at the Department of Justice, and spent several hours there meeting with top officials there and in the FBI, it was my somewhat squirmy task to have to say to them, this law is on the books. Everyone knows it's on the books. Well, that's not true. Only people who really have looked into it. And it's never been applied in situations like the one involving my daughter. And I'm asking you to make this the case that you will go after the murderer. You know exactly where she is. My daughter was an American citizen. Please do it. And the responses were very positive. The only thing that was somewhat troublesome leaving those meetings was, we can't update you, and we will only be able to come back to you when there's something to report. And as I've said in several other places, I came home and told my wife, we're in for a long wait. This may be many weeks. But that was February of 2012, and it wasn't until March of 2017, so we're talking 5 full years of utter silence, before we became aware that the officials in the Department of Justice actually did what they said they were going to do. They had prepared a case. They had gotten an indictment from a federal judge in Washington, but it was under seal at their request, meaning that no one could know about it. Various efforts were made to engage with the government of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to, I have to imagine, because no one has told it to me in this detail, hand over this woman so that there isn't a big fuss made about it, but they refused. And at the point where we were notified about everything that I've just said in these last few seconds, which was March 2017, it was very clear that the Jordanians weren't cooperating. So we were called to a meeting here in Jerusalem on the 14th of March 2017. We didn't really know why, and we were stunned when we were told that 3 hours from now in Washington, we're going to be announcing an indictment against this woman who's living free in Jordan. We're going to announce that she's been added to the FBI's most wanted terrorists list, something I'd never heard of, didn't know what it was, and there's an arrest order against her. I have to say that for a very short time, probably less than an hour, my wife and I were jubilant. And it was only after we left the hotel where we were meeting these officials that some of the questions began to emerge. We did some checking up on the internet, and then we had some serious questions which are still with us until today.
Sure. But I mean, one of them is Jordan does have a extradition treaty with the United States, and and people have been extradited from Jordan. But in this case, the Jordanian government is so far dead set against extraditing Tamimi, and then as we mentioned, she's a hero over there. What's been happening more recently?
The first most recent event relates to something you just said. There is a treaty between the two countries. Well, who says? The Jordanians, within a week of the handing down or the unsealing of the indictment, engineered a session of their highest court, which is called the Court of Cassation, in which it ruled that though the extradition treaty had been signed and passed into law in both countries in 1995 during the lifetime of King Hussein, the father of the present king, and the presidency of Clinton, the proper constitutional view of that treaty is that it was invalid from the day that it was signed. Now, I'm trying to hold back the comments that I would really like to say, and I have never really said them anywhere in public, but let me confine myself to saying this is just rubbish. The fact is, and the court did not take note of it, and no mainstream journalist has ever taken note of it, Jordan has extradited terrorists to the United States every single time it's been requested to do so by the United States, as it should. The whole argument that was presented in the Court of Cassation back then in March 2017 revolved around a supposed technical flaw, which was that the Parliament was supposed to provide some approval to the treaty. This isn't the time. Trust me, though, when I say I've looked at it, lawyers smarter than me have looked at it. Everyone that I know on the American side in the Justice Department and pretty much everywhere I've turned says, well, but not in Jordan. In Jordan, they are on their high horses. This is constitutional. This is a question of our honor. And we're being asked to sell our patrimony and give up all of our precious values. This is all one big performance. They don't want this woman extradited because she is a genuine hero, a genuine hero. If anyone wants to quote anything from this interview, remember those words. She is a genuine hero to the Jordanians. And there are, as far as I can tell, no exceptions. I scan the Jordanian media every day, have done now for several years. I've never yet seen a single hint of criticism of any kind of distance between Jordanian public opinion and what this woman stands for. And she continues today to be free. She doesn't have a TV show anymore, but she lives the life of a celebrity. She was the central figure in an homage that was paid to her last year on a commercial TV station in Jordan. There's a long list of things which in a normal society, if you heard about them, you'd say either somebody has to go to jail or they have to all be taken to the lunatic asylum. But that's not the way it looks from the Jordanian side. They see themselves as being on the moral side, and those of us who want to see this murderer of children who boasts about it, who smiles into the cameras and says how great it was, they see her as their hero, as their success model.
And not only Jordanians, obviously Palestinians do as well. And
what's the difference?
I know, and I've never seen anything in the entire Arab world against this attack altogether. I read daily. I go through Arab sites and I look for various keywords to see what's going on. Occasionally there'll be there has been a change a little bit in the Gulf of things being a little bit more pro-Israel, a little bit more anti-Palestinian, but I've still never seen anything that says that that this sort of attack or any of the other suicide bombings of the Second Intifada or beforehand were anything but heroic, which is just, again, it's a mind-blowing fact that Western media just does not even want to admit is true. And this is...
They won't touch the subject. They won't touch it. You're absolutely right.
They really won't. Some, at least potentially good news, at least I feel it's potentially good. I'm not sure how you feel, but a couple of weeks ago, an organization called Emet managed to get about 7 congressmen. Unfortunately, all of them were Republican. I wish it was more bipartisan, but 7 Republican congressmen to write a letter to the Jordanian government, and essentially, it wasn't quite a threat, but it was an implicit threat, saying that Tamimi should be extradited to the United States. The United States gives a lot of money to Jordan, and you know, and it may be in jeopardy. Tell us what's been happening more recently now.
The key event that is the cornerstone for what you just described happened in December. A law was passed that provides a sanction to the US government to apply against unnamed countries who have an extradition treaty with the United States, who breach the extradition treaty with the United States, who receive foreign aid from the United States. Those countries are not permitted to receive payments from the United States unless the Secretary of State waives this sanction. Now, that's the law. It came into effect on the 20th of December, 2019. I don't want to say that, well, I won't say. There are things that I could say and that I won't say. A number of, and you've mentioned Emet, and let me take this opportunity to say how utterly indebted we, my wife and I, are to Sarah Stern and her team of intrepid activists at Emet in Washington for the fine work they've been doing for years now in support of the effort to bring Tamimi to justice. The seven, as it turns out, the seven GOP representatives led by Representative Greg Stoiber of Florida signed onto a letter that's addressed, in fact, to Jordan's ambassador in Washington, Dina Kawar. The letter reflects a letter that I sent to her in the middle of last year and which she threw straight into the garbage. There's never been a response. I'm going to urge people to try to look at that letter, and you may even have it on your blog, Elder, and certainly I do on my blog, and go through it. It, broadly speaking, does two things. First of all, it asks some discomforting questions about Jordan's extradition treaties with other places, because if we are to believe the claims that have kept Tamimi safe since its highest court handed down its ruling, then what Jordan has done in other extradition treaties with other countries makes absolutely no sense. So if, I'd like to say when, Jordan empowers its ambassador in Washington to answer the letter of the Republican, I shouldn't say Republican, of the lawmakers, hopefully there'll be people from the other side of the aisle who will be joining, then it's in everyone's interests. I believe that in a certain way the Jordanians want to be rid of this monstrous person, but for absolutely understandable political reasons, they find themselves unable to do it. The exceptions to that are those handful of top-level Jordanian officials who I'm quite convinced are absolutely as filled with pride about this monstrous human being as the people in the street are. We're hoping that there will be a Senate version of that letter, and we're also hoping that the sanction will actually kick in. And let me just make concrete something that you touched on briefly. Jordan receives money from the United States. Jordan receives more than every country in the world except for two others in foreign aid. Jordan is utterly dependent on the foreign aid. Now, no one is seeking, I don't think, to punish the Jordanians or make them feel squirmy and awkward. They have an obligation. They have a treaty. King Hussein, the father of King Abdullah II, signed that treaty out of a sense that this is what justice requires, as does good bilateral relations. All that Jordan is being bludgeoned into doing, because that's the way it's being presented by the Jordanians, is to comply with its existing legal treaty obligations. And every single article that I've seen which says, no, 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 there's double jeopardy and there's a constitutional problem, it's all pure invention and nobody should be deceived by it. It's a disgrace to everybody involved.
If there's any tiny spark of good news in this, at least to me, is that there are a couple of interviews that Tamimi has herself made since this letter came out, in which she is expressing fear. She even calls it terrifying. The idea that she's mentioning that she has not heard any support from the Jordanian government. There's certainly been support from Islamist parties in the parliament and the usual crowd that that deals with, like, treats her as like a hero. But she's worried that she has not seen this time around, that she's not seen any official support for her from the government. And I like the idea that she's at least not sleeping well at night. But do you have any insights on what Jordan's going to do?
Absolutely none, nor do I get into the head of Tamimi. I can only say that it is, there's a certain sense of, yes, this is the way it should be, in seeing her now write for the second time in the last few weeks an attack on the king. And the only reason that I mention this in some positive way is that any logical environment, you would expect the king to respond to this and say, who the hell, well, you know where I'm going with this. Why would anybody want to protect, with all of the risks that this entails for Jordan's strategic interests, to protect this creature? So when she says, as she said yesterday, yesterday afternoon, where is the king? The king Jordan hasn't responded to this, I'm forgetting the word, this attack, or this, some absurd word. The 7 GOP signatories on this letter weren't attacking anybody. They were writing to ask Jordan's ambassador in Washington what she thinks about the new sanction. They didn't create the sanction. The sanction was passed by the Congress and signed into law by the president. But if they are caused discomfort, great. There's something completely inappropriate and completely immoral about the way an entire nation is conducting itself as if its values are tied up inside this hideous human being whose only achievement in life has been to massacre a large number of children.
No, that's for sure true. My fear is that because of the Arab honor shame mentality, at this point, since they already previously on record is saying that we're not going to extradite her, that this would be seen as a huge shameful act if they would change their minds, even if Jordanians, the Jordanians king is starting to waver. I believe he would be worried both about shame as well as about stirring things up in his kingdom, because he doesn't have the most. He obviously rules with an iron fist, but he is very worried, and always is worried about public opinion. And so those are very significant obstacles. It seems to me that we should be looking at this letter from these members of Congress as only the opening salvo. I'm hoping, and I believe that there are other things that are in the works. I'm hoping there are other items that are going to be pressuring the king from. I believe you mentioned that the Senate, there may be a letter that's coming out. Jewish organizations should be coming out, like I'm thinking, like the Simon Wiesenthal Center, should be saying something. I even put it in Twitter that J Street, if they really want to pretend that they're pro-Israel and they're anti-terror, they should be pushing Democratic senators that they support to be able to push a letter. There are other. And the fact that you don't see this is scary. There should be far more.
Although this isn't about pro or anti-Israel, it's certainly about terrorism, but really at the end of the day, it's about justice and morality. And I don't understand, and I'm not going to list them here. I've learned to be cautious in where I pour my scorn. I've got lots of it inside. But I'm appalled at the voices that are silent in the face of what's going on. If you look for some kind of serious critical analysis in any part of the media that you can think of about what it takes to bring an entire society to stand behind a terrorist and to call for her to be safeguarded from justice, well, then I'd like to know about it, because I don't know of any. There are no such serious analyses. There has been some sort of uptick in media coverage, mostly in Jewish circles, over the last couple of weeks. A terrific article written by the editor of the Times of Israel, which really did come to grips with a lot of these issues, but only for, I would have to say, an audience smaller than that of the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the New York Times. But there was a serious article from somebody, I'm not going to name him here, who I've admired for years, who is the head of one of the major organizations that produces content for Jewish newspapers. And he named the article "No Justice for Malki." It wasn't a question mark at the end, "No Justice for Malki." I couldn't even understand it, but it was "No Justice for Malki." And he makes a case that really and these are my words, not his, the grown-ups in the room really need to understand that this can't be. And for reasons like those that you just mentioned, Elder, that we can't really expect good King Abdullah to be doing things that are going to cause great problems in his country. And I say, well, first of all, I completely disagree, but I'm also troubled by something that was said there, and I think that at least among the Jews watching this interview, this might resonate. That writer talks about the long Jewish tradition of freeing hostages and argues that prisoner deals are in the spirit of that Jewish tradition. And I have to say, as a descendant of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, our name comes from the name Rothenburg, and our family tradition is we're the descendants of the Rabbi Meir, who is known in traditional circles as the Maharam. The Maharam ended his days in a prison. He was imprisoned in order to enable a certain German political leader, we're talking now of 700 years ago, to squeeze the Jewish community for a ransom. And it's analogous to the situation that we're in now. I don't want to stretch the analogy too far, but it was all about redeeming Pidyon Shvuim, redeeming people who are imprisoned. And contrary to what the gentleman who wrote this article, which is now in quite a number of places, wrote this past week, the Jewish tradition is the exact opposite of what he said. The Shalit deal is the exact opposite of what he said. If the paying of the ransom, which may be expressed in terms of freeing murderers from our prisons, exceeds the usefulness of the payment, which is always going to be the case, then it's forbidden to do it. And that's why the Maharam, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, died in prison, at least according to the traditional view. There are different views, and I'm not getting into the details. But to the extent that there's a Jewish tradition about freeing prisoners, it isn't the way it's being presented by people. It's not the way it was presented during the Shalit deal. It's the exact opposite. We're not in that position now. We can't turn back the clock. Our child's murderer is having a fabulous life in Jordan. She's had a TV show for 5 years. She speaks on platforms with politicians, senior politicians in their society, former prime ministers. She's honored on their TV. She is a hero. My daughter is dead. She's not coming back. We're not doing any of this because we are under the illusion that we will bring her back to life. But the justice of all of this, not the vengeance, not the desire to see Ahlam Tamimi shot or run over or hurt in some other way, to see her stand trial, to answer for the hideous crimes which she's never answered for. That's a passion that we have, and it's called a passion for justice, not for anything else. And for all of the Jewish leadership in particular, but not only, the political leadership in the United States, and we're now reaching out to the political leadership in Australia, where Malki was born and where I was born, this ought to be about justice. And on justice, there's not a lot of room for compromise. And if you're silent when there's a need to speak out on justice, then that's really injustice.
You said it perfectly, and it's 100% true, and the halacha as well is clear. The Jewish law as well is clear that you do not, you don't redeem captives if it's just going to be encouraging more captives. It's and it's logical, and it's fairly obvious. Yes, it is a supreme, idea that to be able to do that's important, but you don't do it if it's just going to mean you're going to be extorted. And you're 100% right. The Shalit deal, and I believe I mentioned to you, I did at the time write something in support of the deal, because I was under the impression that the people that were being released were not going to be able to do any further damage, and I certainly didn't know that there were going to be people that had blood on their hands, and I certainly didn't. I don't think anybody understood that Israel thought, if we just send her to Jordan or wherever it is outside Israel, that it's not going to be a problem, that she would turn into a hero and turn into a symbol, which is much worse than if she would have actually stayed in Judea and Samaria, where she could have said something and then broken the rules, and then Israel could have captured her again. This was that's a mistake in retrospect. Right now we have to deal about the future. We have to deal with what's now, and right now is the chance. There is pressure that's being felt in Jordan. There is pressure that she's feeling, and this is the time that every organization Jewish or not, and pro-Israel or not, any organization.
Justice or not. It's all about justice, Elder. It's all about justice.
Exactly. Anyone that
Human
cares
rights.
about human rights, cares about justice, should be pushing for this, for this extradition, and this letter should only be the beginning. There should be nothing but, every week there should be, or every day there should be another letter that is put into the Jordanian press in which they're saying, oh, here's something else that's going on. In which she feels more nervous, in which the king feels more pressure. This is the only way, and I hope that there is going to be, in the end, justice for Malki, and that there's going to be justice for Ahlam Tamimi, that she does end up behind bars where she belongs. And I salute you for your incredible, the strength and and everything you've been doing in order to be able to do this. And I wish you luck, that you can continue to keep pushing this, and that your message does go to the right people, and that people actually start bringing this to the next level.
Allow me to absorb all of those nice words, which I very much appreciate, but to shift the focus a little. Faced with having to wake up each morning with the knowledge that in Malki's bedroom there's no Malki, we responded, my wife and I and our children, with creating the foundation, the Malki Foundation. We made the decision during the 7 days of mourning, because I was then still working as a that's not true. I wasn't working as a lawyer already, but I had good friends in the law firm where I used to work. We quickly arranged the legal formation of the foundation, and the papers came out on the morning of the basically the 30th day after Malki's murder, which is the 11th of September 2001, 9/11. We didn't know it was 9/11 at that point in the day, but then we learned and continue to relearn almost every day how closely tied this single act of terrorism here in Jerusalem is to a much larger war of the terrorists against civilized society that's going on. But the Malki Foundation has nothing to do with terrorism. There's nothing to do with Ahlam Tamimi. It has nothing to do with Jordan. It's an organization where Malki's name and Malki's message is used to convey positive values, what we call in Jewish traditional terms chesed, loving kindness, not charity, kindness that's done by people who want to benefit other people. Malki loved her own little disabled sister. She took that message and worked with other children with disabilities. The Malki Foundation today provides quite unique support to thousands of families here in Israel. Not all of them are Jewish. In fact, only 2/3 of them are, and the other third, I don't need to explain to you how that works here in Israel. We do good work, and it makes me, basically, it's what keeps me going. If I were to be just focused on the gall and the fury and the scorn and the anger and all those other words, I don't think I'd have much of a life. But just being able to know that this smiling face that you see on the screen over my shoulder is part of an undertaking to help people, just because helping people is good, because that's what we're on earth to do, is something that helps a person survive. I want to point people to malkifoundation.org on the web to see what we do, and to be proud of what Malki's life stood for and how we remember it, because it's all good and it's not to be taken for granted. Not everybody in this world is good.
This is true, and I mentioned last week I was speaking with Kay Wilson. I've had an opportunity to speak to a number of people who are either direct or indirect terror victims in Israel, and many of them have started, whether it's foundations or whether it's initiatives, whether it's different things that be done to these charitable organizations. And it's amazing to me that people take the worst tragedies, and people, so many in Israel, take the worst tragedies and turn it into a positive, and turn it into something that helps so many more people. That it's overwhelming to me, and it is. And you're just you're doing an amazing job with the Malki Foundation, and so many others are, and it's just a testament to how wonderful the Jewish people are, how wonderful the Israeli society is, to be able to take unfortunately so many tragedies and to turn them into something that actually helps people. And again, my admiration is unbounded for people like you to be able to do things like that. The Malki Foundation does amazing work, and so many of these others do as well, and it definitely deserves everybody's support. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining me.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
So again, for now, this was very emotional for me. But thanks a lot. And for now, this is Elder Zion, and I'll be signing off. So take care, everybody.